Welcome to Historically Speaking, episode number 201. And to start this new year, we have a special program with three dear friends as guests today. And we recently passed the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination on the 22nd of November. And this is an opportunity for all of us to delve into our own personal memories. And with this particular event, which defined so many people's lives as to where and what they could tell you they were doing on that day, I think it's important for us to have an opportunity to reflect on the personal story that affected us all as children. My guests today all have in common that they were wonderful educators, distinguished educators, people who spent a life career in teaching. And with each one of my friends, I can tell you most sincerely, what made them wonderful educators is that they always went the extra mile in fulfilling their duty, caring about kids, upholding the highest standards of professionalism. So here we are, and I will introduce each of my guests. Jane Sarno. Jane Sarno taught at Otter Valley for more than 20 plus years. She founded the American Studies program. They brought me on board in 1988. And then in 1997, she left the classroom to lead the school district as curriculum coordinator until her retirement in 2008. Friend Judi Pulsifer, wonderful elementary teacher at Neshabie School, a 44-year span as an educator, and then retiring as principal of Neshabie School in 2021. And George, oh my, after 42 years, there are many things that I can say, but we have in common that George began his teaching career at MSJ, College of St. Joseph. I followed him to Otter Valley, and from there he went on to Mill River. But our purpose in gathering today is that we are going to hear stories of how this extraordinary event, this deeply troubling event, affected young people. And since Jane, you were in junior high school, you were in 9th grade, so tell us what you remember about that day and as you've been thinking about it.
What I remember is that I was in Miss O'Brien's English class. And I remember the announcement over the PA. I was at Lyman Hunt Junior High. And Miss O'Brien, just the look on her face was just so memorable, and all of us were in shock. She then ran out into the hallway and was literally sobbing with other teachers. Soon after that, they announced that we were going to be released from school, and we went home soon thereafter.
Up to that point, do you ever recall being sent home early from school?
It's a good question, Michael, and no, I don't.
Mm-hmm. So once you got home, was your mom at home when you went home?
Probably.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we immediately turned on the TV and watched all of the event.
Mm-hmm. How do you remember your parents commenting on this? Because I assume that your father wouldn't have made it home until the end of the workday.
That's true. Dad definitely didn't come home until later. And I just remember Mom and me, and I don't know if my sister was home. She would have been in high school, but it would have taken her longer to get home. We just sat and absorbed everything that was going on.
And of course, that Monday, there would have been no school.
Absolutely.
Did you spend much of that day in front of the television?
I remember most of that day in front of the television. Yes.
Judi, what do you remember?
Well, I was at Immaculate Heart here in Rutland. Sister Bartholomew was my 4th grade teacher. I have this memory of the class doing something, some activity. I don't know if we were cleaning the classroom or doing something. She had turned to me and said my name and started to ask me to do something when another sister came in and spoke to her. And what stands out in my memory is I didn't know what was being said, but I remember the look on both of their faces. And I didn't see any tears, I just saw extreme upset. My next thought is that we left school. And I don't remember if I knew what had happened at school or I found out when I got home. When I got home, my grandmother and my mother were both there. I had never seen my mother cry until I was in 1st grade when her father died. And that's the only time up to that point that I had seen her cry. And she had tears, and my grandmother had tears, and I remember my grandmother having her rosary out. And we had a picture of the Pope on the wall at that time, certainly a picture of Jesus on the wall, and a picture of John F. Kennedy. In our house, because we were Catholics, it was a huge thing in our family that there was a Catholic president for the first time. I know my grandmother then turned on the television. She watched Walter every night on the news anyways, but just seeing some of the images. But I also, what really stands out in my memory is seeing adults, and not just my mother and my grandmother, but all the adults around me. I don't think up to that point I had ever seen that many adults upset. That to me was scary because usually I think I had viewed adults as these strong pillars. And to see them, and then what really stands out, it was the first time I have a recollection of somebody being killed in that way.
George.
I was in 4th grade as well. I was up at St. Francis, and at 1:30, we'd just come back from lunch. Mother Superior got on the PA and said, "The president has been shot." We all got out of our chairs and knelt down and prayed. And then we went back to normal if we could. And then at 2 o'clock, she said, "President Kennedy has died, and you are all going home." So I remember heading and walking home after that. And I guess the things that stand out, all the same things that they talked about, but from my perspective, I kept thinking how sad this was for his kids as well, that they would be without a father, and he was a young father, and it just seemed like what an awful thing. And then as we watched television forever, because it was on the whole weekend, I just kept being impressed with Jackie's composure. And I thought, well, if she's done anything, she's taught us how to deal with some of the worst things that can happen in life with grace and dignity. So that's what I remember. I was 11, and again, like Judi, I was at a Catholic school and a Catholic family. We didn't have pictures on our walls. We didn't do that, but that's okay. I know a lot of people did. But because he was Catholic, and also because he was from New England, that made a big deal for us. But yeah.
Well, I was not yet in school, so I was 4.
Yes.
And what I remember about that year, 2 things. Most of my friends in the neighborhood were older, and they had already started school. And I could not wait to go to school. If I could have gone to school when I was 4 years old, I would have. And just to fast forward for a minute, all these kids on the first day of school hanging onto the fence, hanging to the mothers crying, I bolted to school. I couldn't wait. So on that November day, I was outside playing near the kitchen. I have a very vivid memory of that. And our next door neighbor, I won't tell his last name lest his remote descendants hear what I have to say about him, but he could have been the prototype for Archie Bunker. He was just a very gruff man, and so he came out of his house, and he was very upset. And he said to me, "Where's your mother?" And I said, "She's in the kitchen." So he went in the kitchen, and I kind of followed along, and they were both crying. And again, I didn't know what had happened, because as a 4-year-old, they probably did not want to tell me much information. So throughout the rest of the day, I knew my mother was upset. There were phone calls made. Adults were speaking in hushed tones. And my father was finishing up his residency at Rhode Island Hospital, and he came home with his white coat on, and he was crying, and I had never seen my father cry at that point. And to go along with what Judi and George noted, I think it was such a big deal that John F. Kennedy was the Catholic president. In my grandmother's kitchen, along with the picture of the Pope, there was the picture of John Kennedy when he was elected in 1960. And I think for people, as I was growing up in Fall River, Massachusetts, there was a deeply personal connection to the Kennedy family. He had been our congressman from 1946. There were enough people with connections to Hyannisport that everybody knew somebody in the Kennedy family. Rose Kennedy was a regular speaker on the Catholic Women's Club circuit. She would be selling her Flame of Hope candles to benefit the mentally challenged, etc. But I think that what really distinguishes between public school kids and Catholic school kids, I mean, it never would have happened in a public school that the teacher would have said, "Please kneel and pray."
No, we did not do that.
Yeah.
Even though I'm sure Miss O'Brien would have loved us to have done that, but
I don't remember anything about Saturday morning. You know, many people talked about seeing the transferring of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby shooting him. I don't have any recollection of that, because at that point, their television was not part of a daily routine. And I think that this was probably the first live stream media event of a television generation, because even though the McCarthy hearings had been broadcast 10 years before, people didn't watch them all day. But what I do remember about what happened on Monday, we had a new recliner, a genuine Naugahyde burgundy recliner in the upstairs sitting room. We had a typical boxy TV with so-so reception. We did not have an antenna on the roof. We had rabbit ears, so sometimes you'd have to play with the dial to get better reception. And one thing I loved to do, if it was actually dark, to turn off the television in a dark room and see the tubes glowing at the back of the television. But on that Monday, my mother said to me, "You are going to watch this, and you are going to remember this, because this is part of history." And this recliner, which still has a life today, we gave it to a friend who lives on Sugar Hollow Road, we did not need, but as a little person, I'd sit in the recliner, and I didn't have enough heft to make the little footrest go up. So I'm sitting there watching this, I must admit, getting a little bit bored. But when the horse-drawn casket was pulled along, that and the horse, but my real focus of attention was John, because John was a year younger than I, and that previous Easter, I had a Buster Brown suit like his. So I was watching John, and at one point, when the camera was focused on him, he kind of, I don't know if he moistened his lips or he stuck out his tongue like that. And I said to my mother, who was in the next room, "He stuck out his tongue, he stuck out his tongue." So when my mother came back into the room, she said, "Of course he did it. You imagine that." So 30 years go by. We are at the John F. Kennedy Library in Dorchester, and they were doing the live stream of all of this. And he got a little impatient waiting for me, so he went on to the next exhibition. So I'm in front of this screen, and I thought, I just need to validate this memory. I am going to wait. Other people are near me, and all of a sudden, I saw it. I saw that tongue go out, and I said, yes! Well, I think I frightened people away. They thought I was probably... But that's what I remember most. And then, you know, as we can see here from all the various issues of Post, Life, and Look, and the memorial album, and the book that my parents bought for me, and it was one of those books that they said you'll grow into. This has been just so reinforced by media. But I think for us it's important to acknowledge how this impacted all of us. So Jane, in the years that you taught American Studies, did this ever come up as part of the way that we looked at our past, the 60s, the Kennedy assassination, et cetera?
We certainly talked about it, Michael, but I don't know that we gave it perhaps its full credit or impact. Judy Dardek was the history teacher, and we shared our memories of it, but I don't know that we gave it its full credit.
Judy, with little kids, was there ever an opportunity to talk about this, or the fact that they must have thought it was remarkable that you could have been alive at that point?
I thought it was remarkable much later in life that I'd been. I don't ever remember this coming up. You know, I taught multi-age first and second grade classroom for most of my career, for about 26 years, and I don't remember this coming up. I remember other things like 9/11, and then children, the connection of 9/11 and the difference of the TV we watched that you're talking about for John F. Kennedy. My recollection is how 9/11, the children kept thinking that same plane kept going through multiple buildings because the way it was played is different than this was. But no, I don't.
Now, yeah, of course, you never had the opportunity to teach history, but there is something that we do have in common, is speech. Because both George and I at different times in our teaching career taught speech, and we would have models for kids to follow. So certainly that memorial album that we have in other incarnations, we would analyze JFK's inaugural address and get students to recognize all the rhetorical devices. And I know at many times we would juxtapose the I Have a Dream speech with Kennedy's inauguration. So I think that is one of the things that distinguished his presidency. He had a lot of help, I'm sure, writing these speeches, but there are very few American presidents of the 20th century that would be renowned for their rhetoric and their oratory. And a fun connection that I used to like to tell the kids, one of the two best preparations, I think, for public speaking that I ever had was debate in high school and having to just think on my feet. But also, when I was in the seminary, my homiletics class. And this woman who was my homiletics professor, we called her the Dragon Lady because she would shred you to pieces just in the way of making sure that you weren't using junk phrases, et cetera, et cetera. And her claim to fame, Frances Leshoto, and she lived to be well into her 90s, she was the professor of speech emerita at Emerson College, and she was JFK's speech coach in the 1960 campaign because people felt, and as we listened to John F. Kennedy, his Boston accent was much more pronounced than either of his brothers. And
Yes.
since part of the whole thing to get Kennedy as a Catholic accepted in other parts of the country, one of his dream team said, you know, you need to tone down the ahs a little bit. So she worked with him. So when I had speech with the kids, I would say, we have in common that JFK and I had the same person as a speech coach.
That's amazing.
The other interesting connection with Fall River, I used to go to the YMCA downtown every Saturday morning, and my mother would give me a couple of bucks, and there was a wonderful French bakery 2 doors away from the YMCA, and for $2.50 you could get a wonderful French meat pie, and I would bring that home for supper. But pride of place in the bakery, right where the string came down from the ceiling, was John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline's wedding picture, because Plourd's Bakery in Fall River made the cake. Because JFK was married at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, which incidentally was where my father's grandparents were married in 1889. So these really interesting
Nice
personal connections. The other thing I can tell you too is that in the Otter Valley Library, which all of you know, and I still think it's the Dewey System, the 920s, we had at one point 24 books on Kennedys. There was literally feet on the shelves of books on Kennedys from at appropriate age levels, but probably as time went on, just a fascination with all the different accounts of the assassination. Some of them were kind of far out, and with kids choosing research topics, I would say because of our resources, there's only going to be one of you, you're going to put your names in the hat, that can research the Kennedy assassination. So this is something that even though people did not experience it like we did, there was this fascination about it, and certainly there's probably been more speculation about Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, et cetera, et cetera. So Jane, 60 years on and thinking about this, probably focused in this way, that here we are, we're looking back on something from 60 years ago. What do you think the significance of this is in terms of our history?
I do think it was really important that he was the first Catholic president. I remember all of that conversation. I was not in a Catholic family, and I know that that was discussed in my family. And when I think back on this, how we were all so shaken by this killing, and I hate to say it, but now we're almost immune to it because there are so many. It's very sad.
Yeah.
Very, very sad.
George?
I think it was the first time, and I know this now as an adult, back then I was sure I didn't know. I think it was the first time our country, because of television, was pulled together from sea to shining sea, and we all were focused on the same thing. And it was, television brought us together, and we mourned together, and we dealt with that loss together, and we probably became a more unified people, certainly than we are today. You know, and in my teaching years, I remember the first time I really felt I was getting old. It's when I was talking with kids before class, and we were talking about different things that had happened when we were young. And I brought up the Kennedy assassination, and they all had this look like, well, that's in the history books. Right. And I was like, oh my God, I'm really getting old. Now I know I am, but back then it was like the first time I got hit with.
Yes.
Yeah, nobody remembers that except for me in this room.
Judi, what do you think all these years later?
Well, I think it's the fact he was a Catholic and also that he was his age.
Yeah, he was young.
That, you know, I can remember I used to have a record, 45, there used to be a song about him, the youngest president. But yesterday when I was watching the news about the Iowa shooting, it brought to mind this because exactly what George said. I was thinking, all my memories are of everybody pulling together, everybody feeling hurt. It was us as a country that was unified in this sorrow. And yesterday, you know, you watch the shooting and then there were different people talking about the rights of gun owners, and it just divides our country. Whereas this was one country united in sorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that in the various anniversaries, we were actually, I remember this, we were in Pittsfield, Mass, the weekend of November 22nd, let's see, the 25th would have been in '88. I was giving a talk at the Berkshire Athenaeum. And one of the things that, you know, and looking at Dan Rather, who was there reporting it from the beginning, and once again looking at all the different commissions, beginning with the Warren Commission, did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone? And I think that with all the allegations of how much did LBJ know, et cetera, I thought the most powerful reminder was that when the president was assassinated, his brother was the Attorney General. And if Johnson in any way had something to do with this, Bobby certainly would have said something. And the other thing that I think for me was a truly visceral experience is that in January of 2004, I had the opportunity to go to a conference in Dallas, and part of our tour was visiting the Texas School Book Repository, and we were given special access to the empty floor, and I got to look out that window. And I think in all the years, all the memories in teaching of it, when I looked out the window at the distance, I thought, wow, he is one heck of a marksman. But I think that those of us that deeply feel history, we truly feel it. And when I looked out that window, I had this wave of emotion come over me because I realized it was one or two moments in time that forever changed our history. And I think the other thing that is part of all of this is how death transformed John F. Kennedy. And I think when a president like Lincoln is a martyred president, all the coincidences between those two assassinations, it transforms them in the way that we look at them. And I think part of the reason why we had such an expansive collection of books in the Otter Valley Library about the Kennedy assassination is that there was very much a conscious myth-making with Camelot, with Jacqueline Kennedy approaching Theodore White. And I think, too, that is there has been a lot of tearing down with history, but I don't think that any of us who can remember will dispute the power that he had while in office, the inspiration, the youth, seeing a young family. And there's no better way to juxtapose that. When Dwight D. Eisenhower left office in January of 1961, to that date, he was the oldest American president. He looked like everyone's grandfather. Where John Kennedy, who looked younger than his years, with little kids in the White House, that's something that made a profound impact on people. So friends, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for sharing. It's been a great experience. Thanks again.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.